Okay, if you try to look at this equation from a different perspective, let's say we replace temporarily, just imagine, and you can just watch this, you don't need to write it down, but look at this as if that said x squared minus 1 equals 0. Wouldn't you realize, oh, wait a minute, that's dots. So let me do x plus 1, x minus 1, and then you would do your t-chart, right? Well, you're going to do the same thing. The only difference is it's not x squared, it's sine squared x, which basically really what that does mean is that means it's sine x and that quantity squared. Okay, that's another way to write it. Not that you have to, but you can. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do similar to what I have over there on the right-hand side. And I'm going to break that sine squared x down to sine x and sine x, because when I multiply those, I get sine squared. And then the one of them will be a plus 1, and one of them will be a minus 1. So just like that, okay? And then you're going to t-chart. Okay, let me rewrite that so that I've got a little bit more room down here. So I have sine x plus 1, and then I have sine x minus 1 equals 0. All right, so I'm going to t-chart this, and I'm going to take each value, and I'm going to set it equal to 0. And then I'm going to take my other factor as well, and I'm going to set that equal to 0. So I'm going to subtract 1, and over here I'm going to add 1. So on the left, I'm going to get sine of x equals negative 1. And on the right, I'm going to get sine of x equals positive 1. Okay, so remember, this is just simply saying what angle has a sine that's negative 1. And this is saying what angle has a sine that's positive 1. So you won't find that in your 30, 45, 60 chart because those are all fractions, right? So that should be in your unit circle. So if you look, I think it's on page 4 of your previous notes from unit 4, you would see that the angle whose sine is negative 1 is simply 270 degrees. So x is going to be 270 degrees. And there is no other angle measure that has a sine that's equivalent to negative 1. So we just want to put this in radian form, so that would be 3 pi over 2. And there's your answer. Okay, we're going to do the same thing here. What angle has a sine that's positive 1? And again, look at your unit circle, and that would be 90 degrees, which we know is pi over 2. So there are your two answers. Okay, so for number 3, and again, make sure you're taking notes in your packet. I would kind of try to imagine that this is like 2x squared plus x equals 0. And hopefully that you'll see when you're looking at this, oh, wait, they both have an x in common. Okay, so I would take out that x, and I'd be left with 2x plus 1, right? Equals 0. Well, I'm going to do the same thing over here. Hopefully you'll see that like these guys have a common x value that we factored out, these guys have a common sine x value that we can factor out. So I'm going to take out that sine x, and I'm left with 2 sine x plus 1 equals 0. Now look at the similarities here. Sine x, there's your x. 2 sine x plus 1, 2x plus 1. Okay? All right, so then the next step would be to do the t-chart. So over here on the left, I'm going to get the sine of x is equal to 0. And on the right, I'm going to get 2 sine x plus 1 is equal to 0. Okay, so on the left-hand side, you're going to ask yourself what angle has a sine that's 0. What angle has a sine that's 0? So hopefully you will say, well, 0 has a sine of 0. So does 180. And so does 360. All right, now just be careful, because if you look back at the domain in the directions, it does not include 2 pi, which is 360. So we are going to eliminate this answer because that's not within the domain. All right, so final answer here. So here we're just going to have 0 pi, and here we're going to just have pi. So your two answers on this side are just 0 pi and pi. Okay, now let's look on the right-hand side. So we're going to try to isolate that sine x. So I'm going to move the 1 over. Then I'm going to get 2 sine x equals -1. Again, let's isolate that sine x a little bit more. So I'm going to get rid of that 2. And that's going to give me sine x equals -1/2. Okay, so if you remember from the previous packet, don't freak out about this negative. That just tells you what quadrant you're in. So basically you're looking for the angle whose sine is 1/2. Don't worry about the negative right now. Angle whose sine is 1/2. So you go to that 30, 45, 60 chart, or the brain, okay, and hopefully you realize that that's 30 degrees. So there's your reference angle. All right, so now let's look at what quadrants we're in. Now that value, -1/2, is negative. So we're looking for where the sine is negative, and that would be in these two quadrants. Here's where sine is negative. So our answers are going to be in the third quadrant and in the fourth quadrant. Okay, now we know that the reference angle is 30 degrees, right? And remember, 30 degrees is pi over 6. So I know that in the third quadrant, this is going to be some multiple of pi over 6. Oops, you know what? Let me back up a second here. Let me leave that for a second and let me go back over here. I'm sorry. So in the third quadrant, let's find the angle measure first. So remember, in the third quadrant, we add 180 to your reference angle. So I'm going to add 180 to this 30, right? So that is going to be 210 degrees. So there's the degree measure. I'm sorry I messed that up. But so ask yourself, what do you multiply 30 by to get to 210? And hopefully you realize that you multiply 30 by 7. So then this pi over 6 is just going to get multiplied by 7. So that's what I was meaning to do before. Okay, so let's do it right this time. So in the fourth quadrant, remember the rule is 360 minus the reference angle. So 360 minus this 30. So 360 minus that 30 is 330 degrees. And then we know that this is going to be some multiple of 30 degrees, so some multiple of pi over 6. And then just ask yourself, I have 30, what do I multiply that by to get to 330? 30 times what gives me 330? And that is 11, so we multiply this by 11. So I have 11 pi over 6, and I've got 7 pi over 6. So you have 4 answers here. So you've got 0 pi, and then we also have 7 pi over 6 and 11 pi over 6. Last question that we're going to work on. So go to number 5 in your packet. Again, make sure you're taking notes. So this is, if we're kind of going along with what we were doing on the other two questions, you kind of mentally can eliminate the sine x's there and just think of it like 2x squared plus x minus 1 equals 0. And we would see that the lead coefficient's not a 1, so I'm going to have to rainbow. So I would rainbow here, and then I would go about my merry way here, saying what multiplies to -2 and adds to 1. Okay? So what I'm doing right now is exactly what we're going to do with regards to the original question. So I say, well, what would multiply to negative 2 and add to 1? And hopefully you would say positive 2 and negative 1. So remember, when we're doing the rainbow method, we bring down the first term, and then we bring down the last term, and then again what multiplies to negative 2 and adds to positive 1. So that would be a positive 2 sine x and a minus 1 sine x. Okay, then we group, and let's factor out a GCF. So in the first group, I see that I've got 2 sine x in both of those terms. And so if I factor that out, I'm left with sine x plus 1. All right, so now let's look at the second grouping.
You can hear me, hopefully?
Okay, you set this equal to 0.
Jay, I think.
Okay, so let me just rewrite this so it's a little more centered and I have more room. So let's write it as 2 sine x times sine x plus 1 equals 0. Okay, so let's t-chart. All right, so let's take the left side, 2 sine x. Let's set that equal to 0. Let's divide out the 2. And we are left with sine x equals 0. Okay, so what angle has a sine that's equal to 0? And hopefully you will say 0, 180, and 360. Okay, but again, 360 is not in the domain because it's less than 2 pi, and that is equal to 2 pi. So our final answers on this side are 0 pi and 1 pi. Okay, now on the other side, we're going to take sine x plus 1, set that equal to 0. Let's move the 1 over. And we will get the sine of x is equal to negative 1. All right, so we are looking for the angle whose sine is negative 1. So go to your unit circle, look for where the sine value, which is the y value, is equal to negative 1, and you should get 270. Right? But we want to put that in radian form. So that's going to be 3 pi over 2.